Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Columbus Museum. I'm Marianne Richter, Director of the museum, and we're delighted to have you here for the reception for HodgePodge Lodge, which features an exhibition of work by Martha Clippinger. We are delighted to have Martha here tonight to speak about her work, which is on view in the Liebern Gallery through November 12th. As many of you may know, but maybe not all, Martha was born and raised in Columbus and is now receiving national attention. So we're very excited to have her work on view at the museum and to welcome her home this evening and to have somebody that talented from Columbus coming back to visit us. So that's fantastic. Dr. Jonathan Waltz, the museum's Director of Curatorial Affairs and Curator of American Art, organized HodgePodge Lodge, working closely with Martha. And Jonathan has been here for just over 1 year, and among other priorities, he has focused on presenting work through exhibition and acquisitions by nationally recognized artists who are from our region or worked here for a period of time. I would like to draw your attention, if you didn't see it upstairs already, to the terrific interview that Jonathan conducted with Martha. Copies of that interview are in the exhibition space and on some of the tables. And Jonathan will now come up and tell you a little bit more about Martha's background and introduce her. Thank you.
This is always such a poignant moment for me as a curator because what you see physically in the space is really just sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of all of the relationships and work and negotiations and collaborating that had to go into putting this project together, not unlike other projects. So I'm particularly happy to be here and feel so accomplished with such a talented artist sharing her work with us. When I was coming to interview for the job here, I knew that I would be asked to come up with some exhibition proposals as part of the interview. And so I started looking on various museum databases and national inventories to see if I could figure out if there were any artists from Columbus, and of course immediately stumbled across and was reminded that Alma Thomas is from here. But as I kept digging and digging, a name kept coming up over and over again, and that was the name of Martha Clippinger. So my curiosity was really piqued, and that sort of exercise for a job interview ended up coming to fruition in the exhibition that's upstairs. Martha received a BA cum laude in art history and visual arts from Fordham University, and then she continued her studies and received an MFA from Rutgers University, both very strong programs. I'm particularly impressed, and I think probably all of those internet hits came up because for someone at her stage in their career, she's already received quite an impressive amount of recognition in the form of fellowships, awards, and residencies. And institutions who have recognized her work include such august organizations as the Joan Mitchell Foundation, the Edward Albee Foundation, the MacDowell Colony, the Atlantic Center for the Arts, the National Academy of Design Museum, and the Fulbright Foundation. This latter organization funded almost a year of time in Oaxaca, in Mexico, so that Martha could research plant-based dyes and traditional weaving techniques. And as you'll see in the exhibition upstairs, and I'm sure in her presentation, that experience affected her deeply and continues to inspire her thinking and her output. Collections come together, exhibitions come together, and installations come together in a variety of ways. I really can't ever predict exactly what's going to happen in terms of any particular project. But as I was researching, specifically doing picture research on Martha and her output, a particular poem kept coming to mind because of the multiplicity of the form of her work, that it's not really one thing or the other. It's a hybrid a lot of the time. It's very colorful, and she doesn't have a limited palette at all. She likes all the colors. She is very open to using lots of different kinds of material. So I kept thinking about this poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins that I just wanted to read really quickly. It's called Pied Beauty. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire-coal chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plow, and all trades, their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle dim, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change, praise him. Working with a living artist means that you have to run a lot of things by them. You can't, as curator, sort of just drive the bulldozer into the future of the project. So originally I wanted to call the project Pied Beauty because of those amazing sort of oral rhymes that Gerard Manley Hopkins writes in this poem. Whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how. It just kind of kept reminding me of Martha's work. We realized, though, in conversation that the religious overtones of the poem might not be that super appropriate. So I put my thinking cap back on and thought back to a childhood experience of mine, which I shared with Martha, and I'm very happy to say that she felt a lot of resonance. HodgePodge Lodge is sort of a phrase out in the world, but for me specifically, it's a TV show from my childhood that was originated by the public broadcasting system in Baltimore City, and it involved a woman named Miss Jean who invited two students to the Hodgepodge Lodge, and they would, over 30 minutes, learn all about science and nature. And being filmed in the 70s, of course, it has a real palette similar to what Martha uses, and also there's a lot of emphasis on tactility and sort of curiosity that I think really resonates with both Martha's practice and her output as well. I have to say, just in conclusion, that I've been working with contemporary artists for about 10 years, and I would be hard-pressed to think of another artist who is so full of wonder, who is so curious about the world, and is so interested in direct experience. And so with that, I wanted to just also say a special welcome to our Young Art Patrons Board, because they banded together and bought a sketch of a carpet for the museum, and that will be on view in the winter when we open a show called Women on Paper. So I wanted to thank the Young Art Patrons Board for that particular acquisition. I've talked way too much because we really want to hear Martha, so please help me and welcome Martha Clippinger.
Okay, hi everyone, thanks for coming, and Jonathan, thank you so much for that introduction. This is my first solo museum exhibition, and it really just couldn't be in a better place. I grew up here, I grew up coming to the museum, and so it's special for it to be here, but also this is the first time creating a solo exhibition with a curator, and I really couldn't have asked for a better curator to work with, and I'm appreciative of the friendship that has developed, and thank you for reading the Gerard Manley Hopkins poem. My mother can't be here tonight, but he was one of her favorite poets, so she'll love that. But anyways, to get started, I don't usually go this far back with my work, but since I'm back home, I figured why not. So we're going to go back to 1990 when I was about 7 years old. And this is probably, oh, shoot, that's not, that's coming next. I just want to get the timer going. Hold on, before I talk too long. Just a minute. Or y'all can just tell me to shut up. Yeah, we'll just go. Okay. Anyways, so like I said, it's probably not my best work, but it does. Just a minute. Why is this not going? Okay, great. So this work now rests on top of like a medicine cabinet in my brother Jeffrey's bathroom. So he took a picture of it and sent it to me, but I thought it was really sweet that he kept it all these years. But it must have been created shortly after I visited Pasaquan. And I was really fortunate to grow up with parents who appreciated art and would take me to see art. So at an early age, I experienced Pasaquan. Of course, the colors and patterns of Eddie Owens Martin's Pasaquan just really had a major impact on me and sort of how I viewed the world and thought of ways of making art and just kind of how you could just live with art. And speaking of living with art, I also knew a former Columbus Museum patron. So on the top left, this is Norman Rothschild that some of y'all might remember. But he would buy shirts from my father, and so my father developed a relationship with him, and occasionally we would ride our bikes from Hilton Avenue over to Norman's house on 17th Street. And, Norman was a collector, and so it was, at a young age that I got to experience sort of a house full of original artworks and was really always just kind of marveling at what was in his house, and then also took note of how he would collect and donate works to the museum. And just because I had a picture of Norman with dreadlocks and a horse named Silly wearing dreadlocks, I thought I'd use this as a segue to talk about when I was little. I rode horses for a period of time, and there was a barn out on Macon Road, and I'd get to spend the summer days there just like mucking stalls and cleaning tack. And then there was a guy who did maintenance there named John. We called him Big John. But anyways, Big John would let us paint the poles. So this is a picture of my friend Mary Rayleigh and me after we had painted poles and we're taking them out to make horse jumps with them. But I feel like it was probably an early experience in color theory for me because the paints were awful colors. And it was almost like they had gone and bought the Oops paint in the hardware store. And so it was like this practice in trying to make bad colors look good. But I loved the process, and I also love stripes, and so you'll see more stripes in the future. And then fast forward to high school, I always loved to sew and would, sew skirts and simple things. But my senior year in high school, I did costume design for a play called Once on This Island. And so this is a part of the cast. It was a really big cast. But these were the four main gods, and they were sort of the most colorful creatures. But it was exciting to create sort of art that would move and to see it be on stage and move. And it's something I'd actually really like to return to. And I didn't realize it, but I was reading about Alma Thomas, and she had originally intended to study costume design. But also my senior year at Columbus High, I learned how to quilt with master quilt maker Kathy Fussell, who is here tonight. And so these are pictures of me making that first quilt. And I mentioned before my father was a shirt salesman, so I used Arrow shirt samples. So on the left, you can kind of see it's basically a selection of men's fashion from 2000. But on the top right is me and Kathy's dining room putting the batting out, and then on the bottom right is us at Hancock Fabrics trying to figure out the backing for the quilt. And Hancock Fabrics held a special place in my heart growing up because before I could drive, I would ride my bike from Hilton Avenue down to Hancock. And anyways, I had one video that didn't make it in because it was just overwhelming the computer. But it was this crushed green velvet with different colored sequins, and I just like fell in love with it and had to make something. And my mother made a dress for me for the 6th grade dance, and it looked like a Christmas tree. So, and then furthering my fashion explorations, for my senior prom dress, I asked Butch Anthony if he would mind painting a dress for me. So I delivered a white dress to his house, and when I picked it up, it was red, and he had used latex paint to paint it, and the dress was already a little long, so it was stiff as a board, and I had to kind of walk like a robot. But on the dress are quotes from a Simplicity Patterns book from the 50s that Butch probably picked up at Possum Trot, and then there are also little drawings and notes that he copied off of John Henry Toney's drawing board. So I had a lot of John Henry Toney's girlfriend's phone numbers on my prom dress. But after that, I left Columbus and moved to New York to study art history at Fordham University. And really my intention was never to be an artist. I always loved art, I always loved making things, but I really wanted to just study art. And so one of the classes I had early on at Fordham was a modern art history class, and the cover of the textbook was this cover on the left with a baby quilt that was made by Sonia Delaunay in 1911. And, I just really remember spending time studying this quilt and loving it and thinking it was great, and she was great. And years later, I came across this picture of her. She was a fashion designer. I mean, she was an artist that worked in a variety of media, and she was married to the artist Robert Delaunay, who had lots of theories about color, and simultaneity was what they called it. It was about putting together contrasting colors. So there were just lots of things that I loved about Sonia. And I discovered this car, and it was like, oh, I know some art cars. And so it took me back to Butch and his Alabama Mamma Jamma, the hearse that he had painted. But also, when I was at Fordham, it was really just like I had to go to New York because I wanted to see art, and so I was always going to museums, and a lot of times I'd go by myself, and there was an exhibition in 2003 of the quilts of Gee's Bend at the Whitney Museum, and I remember going and just really being like blown away and excited because, of course, I understood the process of how the quilts were made because of having made a quilt of my own. But these were just like so much more full of life, and the geometries of them and the colors and the different textures, the way that the quilters were so resourceful in the materials that they used. So this Annie Mae Young quilt, with the worn blue jeans, it really knocked me off my feet. And I couldn't afford a catalog, but I bought some postcards. So I think I had postcards of both of these paintings. And later on, I was taking a studio class and sort of needed to make a painting quickly, and ended up using this quilt not as a direct copy, but just the framework. And within that sort of kind of off-kilter grid and sort of the sort of wonky like geometry of it, I would draw that and then fill in each block with color, and it just opened things up for me because it made me remember how much I loved working with color, and that I always, really loved the geometric patterning, but particularly in these, I could just look at those quilts forever because there would be places where lines would meet and then they would slip, or, there was just so much movement in those works that I decided to use it as inspiration to create paintings. And so I ended up having a senior exhibition as an undergrad, and these were two works that were in the show, and these are larger. These are, I think the one on the left was about 7 feet, and the one on the right was about 5 feet, and it was just unstretched canvas that I tacked up in my dorm room and painted. And then after Fordham, came back home for just a bit, and then went to Rutgers, as Jonathan mentioned. And I went there to study with some abstract painters, Tom Niskowski and Stephen Westphal, but the program was actually interdisciplinary, and so I was interacting with artists of all different walks of life, and and started to open up my process again and think about different materials. So on the left is a work that I made that was just taking 2 different colors of the same pattern of fabric, but creating this sort of stack through using like the same process of piecing that you would use in a quilt. And then years later, I came across this Annie Albers wall hanging, and she's an artist that's become really influential to me. And I just saw a connection with this kind of vertical stacks of horizontal lines. And then later on, again, I was using the same piecing process of putting fabric together, but stretching it around canvases and painting on top of it. And so this is a work that actually is part of the Columbus Museum collection now, and it's titled Annie, after Annie Albers. But on this, the yellow, red, and green parts are actual fabric, and then the gray and the kind of ivory is paint on top of that. And also at Rutgers, I was becoming more interested in architecture and how paintings could occupy architecture. And so on the left is a work called Sound Mixer, and it connects the ceiling to the floor, floor to ceiling. And again, it kind of relates to a quilt in that it's composed out of these small canvases that stack together. So it could really adapt to whatever height of a room you wanted. And then on the right is Corner Stack. And this is a sculpture that came out of just like, you know, you throw things around and then you see like, oh, that's kind of cool. And so I had these scraps of triangles that had accumulated in a corner, and I was like, I could just multiply that and it could become a sculpture. So the one on the right is wood, and it sits into the corner. And then also I started to pick up a lot of scraps in the wood shop and paint patterns on them, and really would just sort of respond to the qualities of whatever piece of wood it was. So there'd be, you know, sort of knots that I would maybe create a pattern based off of, or kind of play off the outline of the wood. So that's just a pile of those. And then after grad school, I moved with some friends to a Ditmas Park in Brooklyn, and was able to rent a small space in the basement from my landlord. And so this was my post-grad school studio, and it looked a lot worse before I moved in. But anyways, during that time, I would go on long walks down Coney Island Avenue and just pick up stuff to make art with. So you'll see like the purple piece on the right, and then that other dotted piece. Those are fruit crates from the vegetable stands, and there's like a rusted baking pan and a metal grate and a magazine rack and some broken IKEA dish drain. So thinking like all these different things that could be made into paintings. But also that space became home to the Dirty Dirty. And this was basically an attempt for me to continue the social activity that I had experienced in grad school. I mean, you know, you're kind of in this bubble where everybody's working and making art and talking about art, and, you know, it's just like really heavenly, and then you get out into the real world and it's hard to really keep those conversations going. And where I lived in Brooklyn was actually pretty isolated. It wasn't like a cool hip art scene like Williamsburg or Bushwick, but it had a little yard space. So this is a poster for one of the Dirty Dirty shows called the Yard Show, and it was like outdoor sculpture. And it was always fun. I mean, the Dirty Dirty was titled the Dirty Dirty because it was a really dirty basement. But also there was the sort of reference to the South as being the Dirty Dirty. So people up north loved that, and I would serve pimento cheese sandwiches and boiled peanuts and stuff. And then the last show, sadly, at the Dirty Dirty was in 2013, and it was an exhibition called On the Fence. And the Dirty Dirty was also kind of like anti-curatorial. It was basically like, come one, come all. If you want to haul your artwork to Ditmas Park and show it, you can do it. So this was On the Fence, and the intention was that everybody show work that they were on the fence about. So we could have conversations about, well, what's really going on, you know? But also, with collecting those objects, I started thinking more about the relationships of paintings. I mean, I'd been thinking about painting as more of an object, and, you know, looking at artists like Mary Heilman and Cesar Paternoster, who would really carry the painting around the front of the canvas and to the sides. So I'd been thinking about paintings as objects, but wanted to really kind of bring the viewer in and have the works engage with the wall in more dramatic ways. So on the left was a found lampshade, and on the right is another work that's in the collection now, and it's made with a peach basket. So if you go into, what's the name of the gallery? Is it 19th? The Hardaway Gallery, you can see the work on the right, Vortex. And then I got really lucky and won the lottery and got a free studio in Dumbo through the Marie Walsh Sharp program. And that was in 2010 to 11. And it was a really spacious studio. And so after being in that cramped basement, I was able to like really collect materials and just let them all hang out. And then the scraps started to layer more and become more and more sculptural. So here's an example of, just kind of thinking about like all these different, scarves that could be painted on, and aluminum foil and cutting canvas. And I make a lot of work that never really gets shown. I mean, there's a lot of process that goes into making things that it's like if you look at this ball of masking tape and a couple, like a blue and a green stripe, I mean, that could maybe be something. But, it's like I just need to make these things to get to the next thing. So there's a lot of sort of byproducts, I guess. And then after that period of time, I had to move back to the apartment. So this was working out of a bedroom. But this sort of gives you an example of the scale that I've really been working in the last 5 or 6 years. No, 6 or 7. Which is a modest scale, and I like it because it's more intimate and it allows the works to really occupy different spaces. But I wanted to show this work because even though I haven't created a grand complex like Pasaquan, I do still see connections with Pasaquan, with like this image, and just kind of how the works sort of function as like symbols. And I particularly love this with just the negative space of the white and how all the shapes interact. So I wanted to just go through and show a couple of works from recent years. And you'll see that, excuse me, I'm interested in both the form and the sort of outline and shape of the work, and also the physical depth and creating relief, and then using color as structure. And I'm also not real fussy about precision. Like, I really like the fact, like, if you look on the bottom of this one, the wood's pretty rough, and I like for that to be evident in the work, and that it's all found wood, and so if it's got a gash in it, I try to just respond to that and incorporate it in different ways, or expose the wood grain. I also will use fabric and layer fabric up, both using fabric as color and to create more texture. So like here, the red triangles are actually bits of fabric that are attached. And then this is to illustrate an idea, and this came up in the gallery earlier, but this work, Chevrons, in the show, and if you study art and you look at minimalism and you think about like site-specific art, I really love that work because it's artists who are very sensitive to thinking about how the viewer is engaging with the work. But I also really like for things to be adaptable, and so this is a work that is meant to go on the floor, but it can go into a corner, but it's also come out of a corner. So on the left, you can see how it's on the floor there and exiting out. And also above it is a work that it's almost like it's stabbed into the wall, and that's in the show, and it's above the wall, so you might miss it if you don't look up. But again, thinking about how you perceive works, where you perceive them, how they interact with both architecture inside, but also the landscape. This was a fabric sculpture that I created, and I was living up north, but would come home every year for the Dew Nanny out in Seal, and it was really always a special experience. But I would like to take advantage of this opportunity to use the woods of wonder, actually, to create a work. So this was a work in 2011 that was meant to complete itself through its reflection. So you'll see it's just the top half that actually exists, and then the rest is a reflection on the water. And then this is just an installation picture of a solo exhibition I had at Elizabeth Harris Gallery. And it sort of illustrates, again, like the tendency to hang things at different heights and really have kind of a playful installation of works. And the catalog for this show, I made little cards. There's that game Memory where you have a stack of cards and there are two of each image. And so this is a picture of my nieces and nephew and then my friends down in Mexico who were playing the game. So the idea was to match the paintings together. And that's something that I really love is toys, and I'm interested in like artist-made toys and looking back at sort of educational tools and thinking of toys I grew up with. So here is a stack of blocks that I painted and someone was arranging on a sofa. So another thing I wanted to talk about while we're here is my time in Mexico. And the first trip I took to Mexico was in 2003 when I was studying art history, and I worked for my art history professor and was able to accompany her as a nanny on a trip with students to Puebla. But while we were in Puebla, we went to Oaxaca, which is where Monte Alban is. And, I mean, Monte Alban was inhabited for 1,500 years, but basically from 500 BC to 850 AD. And it has this incredible history, but the site, it's on top of a mountain, and a lot of the architecture is reflecting the sort of typography beyond. But the geometry of the architecture was really impressive, and I remember like being blown away by the experience of visiting there. And while we were in Puebla, we went to the Sierra Norte and got to see natural dyeing in one of the villages there. And on the right is a quechquimi, which is like a poncho that I bought from that young woman who had made it. So that was back in 2003, and then I returned to Mexico City numerous times just out of my own sort of desire to explore Mexico more. And it wasn't just the like ancient that fascinated me, but also just like the everyday experiences on the street. And so like this snack stand was just kind of an artwork in itself. And then I was also really captivated by the paint colors on the walls. And so I started documenting where those colors would meet, where neighboring buildings. So I created a photo series called Vecinos, and if you speak Spanish, you know vecinos is neighbors. So thinking about like vernacular uses of color. But it was mostly just going to Mexico City. And then, let's see, when was that? I went to a talk at the Newark Museum like in 2011 or something that was about interactions between North and South American abstraction or abstract artists. And there was a presentation by a woman from the Albers Foundation who talked about Joseph Albers' travels to Latin America. And she read all these excerpts of when he had been at Monte Alban, and I was like, oh, I hear it, like that's what I felt, and I have to go back. And so it started like brewing, and then there was this Joseph Albers exhibition at the Morgan Library that was works on paper, and he had this whole series called Variant Adobes, and it's basically him making color studies based off of the architecture of Oaxaca. So it became this sign, and I was like, I've got to get down there. And I want to spend an extended period of time. So I created a proposal to go down and learn more about the natural dyes because, of course, color is really important to me, but I'd only ever really used pigments. And so the whole dye process was interesting, and then the sort of natural dye was even more. So if you've ever heard of cochineal, it's a really strong red dye, and it's created from the cochineal bug that feeds off of cactus leaves. And through its ingestion of the cactus juice, it metabolizes into this carminic acid and creates a really strong, intense red dye. So that's an example of cochineal. On the left, it's actually ground up dead bugs, basically, on the left. And then on the right, the blue is indigo. And here's a picture. This is at a cochineal farm outside of Oaxaca City in Santa Maria, Coyotepec. And so on the left are skeins of wool that had been dyed once in a color, and then on the right are skeins of wool that had been over-dyed. So as opposed to like mixing colors on a palette, you actually mix colors by dyeing them over. So it was really interesting and really fascinating, but sometimes artists think that something's important, and then they realize that maybe it's not as important to them as they thought. So I loved learning all this, but the actual application of my own work didn't evolve like I thought it would, because my color sensibility is much more vibrant, and the natural dyes didn't play out as much. So, but also I was there to study just indigenous textiles. And so in Oaxaca, there's 16 different indigenous groups, and they all have very distinct types of dress, but most of them are wearing pre-Hispanic huipiles is the name, and it's all just a single cloth that is, it's actually 3 cloths that are created on a backstrap loom. I'll show you in just a second. But anyways, I traveled around and got to know some of the different villages, and was interested in just the patterning, the color combinations, some of the symbology in the patterns, but more than anything, the process. And so there's a really great place in Oaxaca called the Textile Museum, and they try to educate people more about these communities and bring in weavers from those communities to instruct people on how their traditional dress is created. So this was me working on a backstrap loom, where basically the tension of the loom is created by your body. So whether you're leaning forward or back, you're able to open up those warp threads. And one of the classes I took was in the style of San Bartolo Yaltepec, and it's this supplementary weft weaving. So if you know, there's like the warp and there's the weft, and patterns can be woven in there, but also you can add wefts in to weave patterns. So that's what the red threads are doing. They're not in the weaving, they're being added to the weaving as it's being made. And later on, I was looking at some more Annie Albers' work and found out that she had discovered this supplementary weft weaving when she and Joseph, her husband, had traveled down to Mexico. And for her, it really opened up the pictorial possibilities of incorporating line and drawing into her own weavings. And so this is actually her weaving. It's hard to see the projector, but it's her interpretation of Monte Alban. But also when I was there, I started studying one of the languages, Zapotec, which there's a variety of Zapotecs, lots of dialects. But in this one village, Teotitlán del Valle, basically everybody's a weaver, and they make weavings with wool. And I was really interested in this village and saw a class advertised to learn that specific dialect and thought, oh, what the hell, I'll take it, So for me, it was actually a 2-for-1 deal because it was taught in Spanish. So, but through practicing at the market, I met this couple, and later on I thought, oh, I should see about having a rug made in one of my designs. So I went back and was like, would y'all be up for doing this? And they were like, yeah, let's do it. So I went out to their house and picked out some skeins of wool, and this was just a little drawing, and then this was the first rug that they made. And this one's actually a mixture of synthetic and natural dyes. The yellow's made with pericon, which is like Mexican tarragon. And then the grays are actually just natural sheep's wool, and then the red and purple are synthetic dyes. So it's become this ongoing collaboration. That first one was made in like March, about April of 2014. So it's been over 3 years now that I've been going down and spending time with them. And sometimes I help with dyeing. Sometimes they do all the dyeing before I get there. Sometimes I'll do a little bit of weaving, but really they're the master weavers, and I'm just designing them and they're executing them. But it is really important and essential that I go and select the colors myself. It's just you can take pictures and send them back and forth on your phone, and actually the technology of this project has sort of progressed over time. Like at the very first year I won't go into all that, but it's become much easier now that they have a cell phone with data, because they don't have internet at their house, so that's the only way to get the message. But anyways, this is basically what I do when I go down there is really rummage through skeins of wool, and I go with designs. And they might be painted, but they might evolve depending on what colors are available. So, with a lot of my work, it's important that I just kind of adjust and make do to whatever I have at hand. So, but also this I wanted to mention, when I did my senior thesis in art history on Vincent van Gogh's portrait of Père Tanguy, and in my research, I found out Van Gogh had this little box of yarn, and they were different colored pieces of yarn, and he would use them to test colors before making paintings. So when I see like this picture, I kind of connect with that process. But this is where most of the action occurs. This is their altar room, which is the main room in the house, and there is an altar there, and it's like the receiving room. Anytime there's a birthday party or any sort of celebratory activity, like people are received there. This was actually like 2 mornings after their daughter's quinceañera, so that's all the beer stacked up on the side. And then this is outside of that room, and you can see the mountains in the distance. And that's Leach on the right, and then her daughter Brenda. And you'll notice in the gallery, all of the rugs have basically horizontal and vertical lines, where I was just keeping with that structure of the weaving. And those are much easier to translate just with a ruler and, figuring out the centimeters for them. But I also wanted to explore making something with curves and angles. And so in order to do that, I actually created a drawing to scale. So on the left is the drawing that I took down to Mexico with me and the wool that I selected for it. And then on the right is the completed tapete. Tapete is a Spanish word for rug. Here's another one. And that one's in the show upstairs. And then this, you can see my drawing on the bottom left, and then Brenda and Leo have their own variations. So anytime I go, I take like school supplies and drawing materials and stuff, and they love to create. They're really good. They create some great designs. But anyways, this was them sort of knocking off this drawing. But the drawing on the bottom left is the one that Jonathan mentioned the young art patrons have purchased. So I'm really happy that it's coming to the museum. And also the museum has this, the actual woven piece from that drawing. So that's it in process on the loom. And throughout the whole time I was in Oaxaca, I was keeping an online journal. So if you're ever interested in Oaxaca and seeing more pictures or thinking about going, I have lots of documentation there. Then these were some early rugs that I made. And a friend acquired the one, and you can see it's at the top of the stairs. But I just wanted to bring this in because it's an example of how sometimes a work will evolve into another medium. So he wanted me to paint his stairs, and I was like, oh, what design? And then we decided to do this. And I put the photo on the left because the front door of the house has this oval, so it's really cool from the street. The stairs flatten out, and you just see this like patterned oval. And then that's at my own house. I just had to have stairs of my own. So, and then this past year, I did the first public commission at Duke University, and it's in their like student center dining hall. It's an impressive building, but they had this huge space above the stairs. And so this was the work I created for, and I wanted to try to make the mural be sculptural. So there are 7 panels. They're each about 8 feet long that are stacked against the wall. And then the gray in between them is actually the painted wall. So I was able to prepare all the panels in advance and then paint the wall on site. And then later this past year, I had a small solo exhibition at the Southeastern Center for Contemporary Art in Winston-Salem. And I brought this in because there's tablecloth that is mentioned in the interview, and also just how other ways that I've exhibited the small wooden works with the tapetes. And you'll see on the top right, there's a little painting that hangs on the ledge. So another work that's kind of hugging architecture. And then last month I went back down to Mexico, and these are the brand spanking new tapetes. I created a website. It's called Shishang. Shishang is like the greeting in Teotihuacan, and everybody does it. It's where you clasp hands and greet one another. And so this website has all of the tapetes I've made so far. And then it also, I'm working to create like sort of a store, I guess. These are small clutches. These are the sides of them. So it's like, I don't know, 12 of them, but just little bags. And then this last trip, I made these bags. So it's a way to provide more work for them, and I enjoy making the designs, and it's also kind of cool, I think, to carry around a painting. So this is changing gears, but I wanted to bring this work in because this is a work by Max Bill that I found at a consignment store about 7 years ago, and I was really excited about it because Max Bill is a Swiss architect designer. Anyways, went to Bauhaus and had an exhibition in Sao Paulo at the Museum of Modern Art in 1951, and had been really influential to some of my favorite artists from Brazil. So this is a painting by Elio Itasica on the top, and then a woodcut by Ligia Pape on the right. And these are early works of both artists. They became much more sensorial and participatory, but their early I love all their work, but these are their early graphic works that were produced after Max Bill had come to Brazil and really made an impression. So I was really excited to find that Max Bill piece. But then later on I was reading about how like Alma Thomas was also really inspired by Max Bill. So on the left is an Art International magazine from 1964 that has a Max Bill painting on the cover. And then on the right is Alma Thomas's work that's sort of playing off of that work. And it was, I think, from 1970 was the exhibition for her. But then it also connected in my mind to the Sam Gilliam piece that's upstairs. And of course, Sam Gilliam and Alma Thomas were contemporaries and both working in Washington in the 60s when these works were made. And then the Sam Gilliam piece was a work that I really wanted to connect my work Arrow to. So when you go upstairs, you'll see how if you're outside of the gallery, I mean, you're inside the contemporary gallery, but outside of the HodgePodge Lodge, you can see how those two are in conversation. And then lastly, this was the lithograph that there are 9 for sale. It's a small edition print that I made with a print shop in Durham called Supergraphic. So I just wanted to show you some of the images of process here. So for the lithograph, it has 8 colors, and on the left, these are transparencies. So each plate would be burned to then create that image on a plate, to then be inked, to then be put through the press. So on the left are the transparencies, on the right are the color tests that I did with the master printmaker, Brian Garner. And then on the left are sort of, in process where 1 or 2 colors were put down, and then on the right it's where the pink is about to be dropped down on the paper. So it's a very complicated, labor-intensive process because each print has to go through 8 times, and then each piece of the puzzle has to fit together just right. And so it's been great working with Brian on this project because we really could not be more different. I'm so loose and cool, and he's like Mr. Precision, but he really did an incredible job on these and was able to get them to all fit together. And then this last photograph is just where we were testing. There's a little bit of transparency, and we were trying to sort of get the color test figured out for the final print. So anyways, that is everything, and I'm happy to answer questions if you have them. So. Are there any? Or we can just go eat cookies. Mike?
We have a lot of students here, and I love that you're talking about the process. Can you talk about a little more, because you've gotten into it a little bit, and you've got how much play plays a part to make your art. It seems to be really, it's unpretentious, it's playful. Can you talk about that a little bit, the act of playing with students?
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of the reason why I put that first sculpture up was because in so many ways, like, not much has changed since I was 7. Like, the actual, I mean, you know, you learn more, but like I'm still collecting scraps of wood and sticks and putting stripes and putting them together. But it really is, it's about, to me, it's a lot about having the materials around. Like, I have to have materials around. Like, I don't draw a sketch and execute a work. It's not a direct line. So I think in like relation to play, I mean, with the blocks and stuff, it's about having materials around that are almost like toys and really moving and interacting them together and seeing like how they respond to one another and how they can fit together. And I mean, it's like a puzzle in a way, but I mean, I definitely think play can be serious. So, yeah. Mhm.
With how often you play and everything, and with these different pieces, how long does it normally take you to really develop the complete piece that you choose to present?
It varies, and you know, there's some works that might just happen, and then there are some that linger for years. So I take a lot of photographs just in my studio, just kind of documenting and keeping a record of things. But it's always interesting to look back because I tend to like develop relationships with them and think of them almost as like characters that I'm living with. And so I'll look at old pictures of the studio and I'll see a work and it's like, oh, that was like their adolescent stage where they were a little awkward and like hadn't fully formed. And so yeah, it really varies. Yeah.
In terms of your process of picking colors, would you say you have to be there in person whenever you pick the colors for your rugs and everything that you do? What would you say your process is in terms of picking and choosing what colors you want for some of your pieces?
It's interesting with the rugs. It's like everything's a very different process with the rugs because with those I sort of have a sense of a palette, but then it's really selecting from what's available. But when I'm making a painting, it's like I'll put down a color and then I'll respond to that color with another color. I don't have like a set palette that I know this work is going to be composed out of these. It really builds one on top of another. And sometimes, you know, I put down a color and then I put down another color. Well, that color affects the first color, so then it changes. I mean, I'm really, you know, thinking back to like your question about play and then also about color. It's all about looking for me, and that sounds kind of obvious for an artist, but it really is, like if you look at Joseph Albers' interaction of color and think about how he talks about color and relationship to other colors, like you have to have it in front of you and look at it to be able to see how it functions and operates. And so I don't know if that's giving you a direct answer, but it's really intuitive for me too. I mean, I just kind of have an instinctual like sense of this is a color I'm interested in. I'm going to start with that and see where it goes. So yeah. Well, thanks, y'all. It's good to be back.